I noticed my name wasn't printed anywhere in my husband's funeral program. Not as his wife of 42 years, not even as a family member, just missing. I stood there in the back of the chapel, holding the folded paper in my hands, reading it again as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something that made sense. But they didn't. They stayed exactly the same, cold and deliberate, listing everyone else as if I had never existed in his life at all. The room smelled faintly of lilies and polished wood, the kind of scent that was supposed to feel respectful, comforting even. But all I felt was distance, like I had already been erased before the service had even begun. People moved past me in quiet clusters, dressed in black, speaking in low, rehearsed tones, and not a single one of them stopped to ask if I was all right. Not a single one met my eyes for more than a second, as if I were someone they couldn't quite place, someone who didn't belong. Then Ashley appeared at my side, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor, her voice low but precise, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to carry authority. "We've arranged seating for immediate family up front," she said, glancing briefly at me before gesturing toward the back row. "You can sit here. It's simpler this way." Simpler. I looked at the row she indicated, far from the casket, far from the photographs of the life I had built with Edward, far from everything that should have been mine, and I nodded because I understood exactly what she meant. Simpler meant quieter, invisible, contained. I walked to the seat without another word, the soft carpet muffling my steps as if even the sound of me moving was too much for this carefully managed version of grief. From where I sat, I could see Daniel in the front row, his shoulders squared, his hand resting over Ashley's as though she were the one holding everything together, as though she were the center of this loss and not me. He didn't turn around. Not once. I folded my hands in my lap and watched as guests filled the seats ahead of me. People Edward had known for decades. People who had sat at our table, laughed in our home, shared holidays and stories. And years that now seemed to belong to someone else's life entirely. A woman leaned across the aisle and whispered something to Ashley, both of them glancing briefly in my direction before exchanging a look that was gone as quickly as it came, but long enough for me to understand. They thought I was a burden now, an afterthought, someone who would quietly fade into the background now that Edward was gone. I sat there, still, composed, my expression unchanged. Even as each small detail settled into place like pieces of a puzzle I hadn't realized I was solving until that very moment. They hadn't just overlooked me. They had already decided who I was without him, and what I was worth without his name beside mine. I let my gaze drift back to the front of the room, to the polished casket, to the framed photograph of Edward smiling the way he always did when he thought no one was watching, and I felt something shift inside me, not loud, not dramatic, just quiet and certain. Because while they arranged their seats and whispered their assumptions, while they measured my value by what they thought I had lost, there was one thing I hadn't lost at all. I didn't correct them. I didn't say a word. I simply sat there in the last row exactly where they had placed me, and let them believe I had nothing. I sat through the entire service without moving, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my back straight, my breathing steady, the way Edward used to tell me to do whenever something felt overwhelming. "Slow down, Margaret," he would say, "do not let the moment control you," and so I did not. Voices rose and fell at the front of the room, carefully chosen words about legacy and kindness and devotion, words that sounded polished and distant, like they had been written for someone else entirely, and I listened as person after person stood up to speak about the man I had shared a life with, each story missing something essential, something quiet and real, something that only existed in the spaces between us that no one else had ever truly seen. Ashley stood near the podium more than once, guiding the order of speakers with a gentle hand on someone's arm. A nod, a soft whisper moving through the room as if she had always belonged at the center of it, as if this had always been her place. Daniel followed her lead without question, his voice low and controlled when he finally spoke, thanking everyone for coming, for their support, for honoring his father, his words measured and appropriate, but there was a distance in them, a careful detachment that settled over the room like a thin layer of dust. He did not look at me then either. Not once. I noticed the small things instead, the details no one else seemed to pay attention to, the way Ashley subtly redirected conversations when someone drifted too close to where I was sitting, the way a few guests hesitated before approaching me, then thought better of it and turned away, as if they had been given some unspoken instruction to keep their distance. A man I recognized from Edward's business circle glanced in my direction, his expression uncertain, then walked past me without a word, and I realized that whatever story had been told about me had already taken hold. I was no longer the woman who had stood beside Edward for decades. I was something else now. Something smaller. After the final hymn, the room shifted, people rising slowly, gathering their coats, their voices growing slightly louder as the formality of the service gave way to polite conversation, and I remained seated for a moment longer, watching as Ashley stepped forward again, thanking the officiant, coordinating the next steps, her composure flawless, her control absolute. When I finally stood, no one rushed to meet me, no one reached for my hand, and that absence felt louder than any words that could have been spoken. I moved toward the aisle at my own pace, aware of the space around me, aware of how easily I could pass through it without being noticed, and as I reached the back of the chapel, I heard Ashley's voice again, soft but clear, speaking to someone just out of sight. "We are keeping things simple. There is no need to complicate matters with unnecessary expectations," she said, and I did not need to ask what she meant. Outside, the air was cool and still, the sky a pale gray that stretched endlessly above the quiet line of cars, and I paused at the top of the steps, taking it in, the silence, the distance, the way everything felt slightly removed, as if I were standing just outside of my own life. Footsteps approached behind me, then slowed, and I turned just enough to see Daniel a few feet away, his expression unreadable, his hands in the pockets of his coat. For a brief moment I thought he might say something, anything at all, but instead he gave a small, almost polite nod, the kind you give to someone you recognize but do not truly know, and then he looked past me, already shifting his attention elsewhere. I held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, long enough to understand that whatever connection had once existed between us had been carefully set aside, replaced by something colder, something easier for him to manage. I inclined my head in return, just as politely, just as distant, and stepped down onto the pavement, my heels making a soft, steady sound against the concrete. I did not call after him. I did not ask for an explanation. I simply walked toward the waiting car, aware of the weight of their assumptions settling around me, and let them remain exactly where they were, unchallenged, unquestioned, and entirely wrong. The ride back to the house was quiet, the kind of silence that did not feel peaceful but deliberate, as if even the driver understood that this was not a day for conversation. I watched the familiar streets pass by through the window, the same sidewalks Edward and I had walked countless evenings, the same corner cafe where he used to insist on stopping every Sunday morning, ordering the same black coffee and pretending he might try something different next time. And for a moment it felt as though nothing had changed, as though I could still turn to my right and find him there, adjusting his watch, offering that small, knowing smile. But when the car turned into the driveway, the illusion slipped away. The house stood exactly as we had left it, white shutters, neatly trimmed hedges, the porch light still on from the night before, yet something about it felt different now, not because it had changed, but because I understood, with a clarity I had not allowed myself before, that I was the only one who still saw it as home. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me, the quiet settling around me immediately heavy. But honest, not like the carefully arranged silence of the chapel, but something real, something that belonged to me. My coat felt heavier than it should have, and I took it off slowly, hanging it in the same place I always had, my movements steady, unhurried, as if I had all the time in the world. For a few seconds I simply stood there, taking in the scent of the house, the faint trace of Edward's cologne still lingering in the air, mixed with the clean, familiar smell of polished wood and fresh linen. Then I noticed it. A small stack of papers placed neatly on the console table by the entrance, too deliberate to be accidental, too visible to be ignored. I walked toward it without rushing, my fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the table before I picked up the top sheet, already knowing, before I read a single word, that whatever was written there had not been left for my benefit. It was written for convenience. The kind that did not include me. The heading was clean and professional, printed in bold letters, outlining what they called next steps. A phrase that felt strangely out of place in a home filled with decades of memories, as if those memories could be summarized, organized, and moved aside with the same efficiency as a business transaction. I read through the lines slowly, noting the details they had already decided on without me, the timeline, the arrangements, the subtle but unmistakable assumption that I would comply, that I would step aside quietly and allow them to reshape everything Edward and I had built together into something that suited them better. There was no question in it. No space for discussion. Only conclusions. I set the paper back down exactly where I had found it, aligning the edges with a precision that surprised even me, and let my hand rest there for a moment longer than necessary. It was not anger that I felt. Not yet. It was something colder. Something clearer. The kind of understanding that does not arrive all at once, but settles in slowly, piece by piece, until there is no room left for doubt. They had already made their decisions. About the house. About my place in it. About what they believed I could or could not do without Edward. I walked into the living room and sat down in the armchair by the window, the one Edward used to tease me about because I always chose it over the larger sofa, saying it fit me better, and I allowed myself a single quiet breath. Outside, the afternoon light stretched across the lawn, calm and unchanged, as if nothing had shifted at all, but inside everything had. I looked at the stack of papers from where I sat, their presence small but undeniable, and I realized that what they had mistaken for weakness was simply patience, and what they had assumed was loss was something entirely different. I did not reach for the phone. I did not call anyone. I did not question what I had already understood. I simply sat there letting the silence settle into something steady, something controlled, and for the first time since the service had begun, I felt completely certain of one thing. I was not the one who had been left behind. I did not touch the papers again that afternoon, not because I was unsure of what they meant, but because I already understood them too well, and instead I let my mind move backward quietly, deliberately, tracing the small moments I had overlooked, the ones that had seemed insignificant at the time but now felt carefully placed, like markers along a path I had not realized I was being led down. It had started long before today, long before the funeral, even before Edward's health had begun to decline in any visible way. Back when Ashley first began offering to help with the finances, her tone always gentle, always reasonable, suggesting that it would be easier if she organized the accounts, the bills, the schedules, saying that Daniel was so busy and that she simply wanted to take some pressure off me. I had agreed then, not because I could not manage it myself, but because I believed in making things easier for family, because that was what I had always done. At first, nothing seemed different, statements still arrived, payments were still made, everything appeared exactly as it always had, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, the details shifted. The mail began to arrive less frequently. Certain documents were no longer left out on the kitchen counter. Conversations about expenses happened in shorter, more controlled exchanges, often between Ashley and Daniel, with me included only at the edges as if my presence were a courtesy rather than a necessity. I remembered the first time I noticed a change in Daniel's tone, a slight hesitation when I asked about a routine payment, the way he glanced at Ashley before answering, as if checking that his response aligned with something already decided. At the time I told myself it was nothing, that grief, stress, and responsibility had a way of altering people's behavior, that I was reading too much into small things. But the pattern continued. Access became limited in subtle ways, passwords changed for security, documents relocated for safekeeping, decisions made to simplify matters, each explanation reasonable on its own, each step small enough not to alarm, yet together forming something unmistakable. I recalled a conversation just a few weeks before Edward passed, when Ashley had stood in this very room, her voice calm, her posture composed, suggesting that it might be wise to begin thinking about future arrangements, mentioning assisted living communities in a tone that implied practicality rather than intention, as though she were presenting an option rather than laying the groundwork for something already planned. Edward had been sitting in his chair by the window then, listening quietly, his expression unreadable, and later that evening, after Ashley and Daniel had left, he had looked at me with a seriousness I had rarely seen in him. "Margaret," he had said, his voice steady but firm, "there are things you need to be aware of, things I have already taken care of, but you must promise me something." I remembered how I had reached for his hand, how warm it had felt, how certain he had been. "Do not react too quickly," he told me, "and do not assume you are as vulnerable as they might believe." At the time I thought he was being cautious, perhaps overly so, preparing for possibilities that might never come, but now, sitting in the same house, with those papers still resting untouched in the other room, his words settled into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. He had seen it before I had. He had understood what I had chosen not to see. I leaned back in the chair, my fingers resting lightly against the armrest, and let that realization settle, not as something overwhelming, but as something steady, something grounding. This had not begun today. It had not begun at the funeral. It had been unfolding quietly, patiently, beneath the surface of ordinary life, waiting for the moment when it would no longer need to hide. And now that moment had arrived, not with noise or confrontation, but with a simple stack of papers on a table and a set of assumptions that revealed more than any direct accusation ever could. I closed my eyes for a brief second, not in exhaustion but in recognition, and when I opened them again, the room looked exactly the same, yet I saw it differently, not as something slipping away from me, but as something that had never truly left my control at all. The house remained quiet well into the evening, the kind of quiet that no longer felt empty but observant, as if it were waiting to see what I would do next, and I let the hours pass without rushing to fill them, moving slowly from one room to another, not out of restlessness, but with intention, noticing details I had not truly seen in years, the way the light shifted across the hardwood floors, the faint creak near the staircase that Edward used to joke about fixing but never did, the framed photographs lining the hallway that captured moments no one else seemed to remember anymore. I paused in front of one of them, a picture taken nearly 20 years ago, Daniel standing between us, younger, unguarded, his hand resting easily on my shoulder, and I studied it for a moment longer than necessary, not with longing, but with a kind of detached clarity, as if I were looking at a version of us that no longer existed in the same way. It was not a sudden change that had brought us here. It had been gradual, shaped by choices, by influence, by a quiet shift in loyalty that had happened so slowly it almost felt natural until it was not. I moved into Edward's study and closed the door behind me, the air inside slightly cooler, carrying the faint scent of leather and paper, and for the first time that day, I allowed myself to sit at his desk. The surface was exactly as he had left it, organized, deliberate, everything in its place, and I rested my hands lightly on the wood, feeling the smooth finish beneath my fingertips. There was a drawer on the right side, one he had always kept locked, not out of secrecy but out of habit, a place for things that required care. And I reached for the key I knew he had hidden, not in a complicated place but somewhere simple, somewhere only I would think to look. It was still there. I turned it slowly in the lock and opened the drawer, not with hesitation, but with quiet certainty, as if I had been preparing for this moment long before I realized it. Inside, everything was arranged with the same precision that defined the rest of his life, documents neatly stacked, folders labeled in his careful handwriting, and on top, an envelope with my name written across it in ink that had not yet faded. I picked it up and held it for a second, not out of doubt, but out of respect for what it represented, then opened it and began to read. His words were clear, direct, unmistakably his, and as I moved through each line, the final pieces settled into place, not as a surprise, but as confirmation of something I had already begun to understand. He had anticipated this. Not in anger, not in distrust, but in awareness, a quiet recognition of the dynamics that had been shifting around us, and he had taken steps, careful, deliberate steps, to ensure that what we had built would not be taken apart by assumption or convenience. There were instructions, not complicated but precise, outlining what existed beyond what anyone else had been allowed to see, accounts that had not been touched, arrangements that had been secured, protections that did not rely on anyone's goodwill. I read every word without rushing, letting the meaning settle fully, and when I finished, I placed the letter back on the desk exactly where I had found it. The number itself did not surprise me. I had always known Edward was careful, thoughtful in ways that extended beyond what he chose to share openly, but seeing it written there, documented, protected, brought a different kind of clarity. $28 million. Not displayed. Not discussed. Not something that needed to be proven to anyone. Just there. Secure. Untouched. I closed the drawer and turned the key again, returning everything to its place, and as I stood, I felt the weight of the day shift once more, not heavier but steadier. As if everything that had felt uncertain only hours before had now aligned into something far more defined. They believed I had been left with nothing. They had built their plans around that belief, shaped their decisions, their assumptions, their quiet conversations around an idea that had never been true. I walked back into the hallway, the house still and composed around me, and I allowed a small, almost imperceptible smile to settle on my face, not out of satisfaction but out of understanding. I did not need to correct them. Not yet. Because sometimes the most revealing thing is not what people say when they know the truth, but what they do when they are certain they already have it. The next morning arrived without urgency, the light filtering softly through the curtains as if nothing in the world had shifted, But I was already awake, seated at the small kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had long since cooled, my hands resting calmly around the mug, my thoughts clear in a way they had not been in years. I did not feel rushed, and that in itself was new, because for so long I had lived within the rhythm of other people's needs, their schedules, their expectations, adjusting myself quietly so that everything around me could remain steady. But now there was no need for that. Now there was only time, and with it a kind of control I had not fully recognized until it was returned to me. I heard the front door open just after 9, the sound deliberate but not cautious, followed by the familiar cadence of Ashley's footsteps moving through the hallway as if she were entering a space she already considered her own. She paused briefly when she saw me at the table, her expression shifting into something polite, composed, the same expression she had worn the day before. "You are up early," she said, setting her handbag down with a soft, controlled motion, her tone carrying that subtle edge of management, as though she were already assessing what needed to be handled. I gave a small nod, lifting the cup slightly before setting it back down. "I have always been an early riser," I replied, my voice even unremarkable, offering nothing more than the surface of a conversation she could easily move past. Daniel followed a moment later, his presence quieter, his movements less certain, but he did not linger in the doorway, did not hesitate long enough to question why I was there, sitting exactly where I had always sat, as though nothing had changed. They exchanged a brief glance, one of those silent communications that no longer needed explanation, and then Ashley stepped forward, placing a folder neatly on the table in front of me, aligning it carefully with the edge as if precision could make the contents more acceptable. "We wanted to go over a few things with you," she said, her voice measured, professional, "just to make sure everything is clear moving forward." I looked at the folder but did not open it immediately, letting the moment stretch just slightly longer than expected, not out of hesitation but out of intention, before finally resting my hand lightly on top of it. "Of course," I said, my tone calm, agreeable, giving her exactly what she anticipated. She began explaining, outlining plans that had already been decided, timelines that had already been set, the house, the accounts, the idea of simplifying arrangements so that I would not have to manage things alone, each word carefully chosen to sound considerate, each sentence built on the assumption that I would accept it without question. Daniel added a few comments, brief, supportive, reinforcing her points without expanding on them, his voice lacking the weight it once carried when he spoke to me, and I listened to both of them without interruption, without correction, my expression unchanged, my posture relaxed, as though I were simply taking in information rather than recognizing the full scope of what they were attempting to establish. When Ashley finished, she looked at me expectantly, waiting for a response, for agreement, for compliance, and I allowed a small pause before speaking, just enough to make the silence noticeable but not uncomfortable. "That sounds very organized," I said, my voice steady, almost appreciative, and I saw the faint shift in her expression, the brief flicker of satisfaction she tried not to show too clearly. She mistook my calm for acceptance. She mistook my silence for agreement. And I let her. I did not open the folder. I did not ask questions. I did not challenge a single point. Instead, I simply nodded once more and stood up, carrying my empty cup to the sink with the same quiet composure I had maintained since the moment I sat down. Behind me, I could feel their attention linger, could sense the subtle relief in the room as they interpreted my reaction exactly the way they wanted to, and I allowed that interpretation to settle, to take hold, to become the foundation for whatever they planned next. Because there was no advantage in correcting them too soon. No benefit in revealing what they had not yet earned the right to understand. I rinsed the cup slowly, placing it in the drying rack with care, and as I turned back toward them, my expression unchanged, my voice calm, I knew something they did not. They believed they were guiding the situation. They believed they were setting the terms. But in reality, all they had done was show me exactly how far they were willing to go when they thought I had nothing left to stand on, and that was information far more valuable than anything written in the folder still resting unopened on the table. I spent the rest of that morning moving through the house as if nothing had changed, as if their plans had not been laid out in neat folders and quiet assumptions just hours before. But beneath that calm routine, I was paying attention in a way I had not before, noticing the rhythm of their movements, the way Ashley spoke more freely when she believed I was not listening, the way Daniel's voice shifted depending on whether he was speaking to me or to her. By early afternoon, they had settled into the living room, papers spread across the coffee table, their voices low but no longer cautious, and I remained just out of sight in the hallway, not hiding, simply existing in a space they had already decided I did not occupy in any meaningful way. If we list it within the next 2 weeks, we can probably get a strong offer before the market shifts, Ashley said, her tone confident, controlled, as though she were discussing something entirely routine, something already within her authority to decide. Daniel nodded, flipping through a set of documents, his brows slightly furrowed, but not with doubt, only with calculation. "And the accounts?" he asked, his voice quieter, almost hesitant, as if some part of him still recognized that there were boundaries he was crossing, even if he chose not to acknowledge them fully. Ashley did not hesitate. "We will consolidate everything," she replied, her words smooth, efficient. "It will be easier to manage that way. She does not need to be overwhelmed with details at this stage. Not my name. Not even a title. Just a distant reference, as though I were already removed from the center of the conversation. I stood there for a moment longer, listening, letting each word settle without interruption, without reaction, because this was the clarity Edward had prepared me for, the moment when their intentions would no longer be disguised as concern or support, but would reveal themselves plainly, shaped by what they believed I could not see. "And the house?" Daniel asked again, his voice steadier now, more aligned with hers. "We move forward," Ashley said simply. "It is too large for her, and maintaining it does not make sense financially." I almost smiled at that, not because it was amusing, but because of how precise the assumption was, how completely it relied on an understanding of my situation that had never been true. They believed they were making practical decisions. They believed they were acting responsibly. And most importantly, they believed they were doing it from a position of control. I stepped into the room then, not abruptly, not in a way that would startle them, but with the same quiet presence I had carried all day, and their conversation paused immediately, the air shifting just slightly as they turned to look at me. Ashley's expression adjusted first, smoothing into something polite, composed, as if nothing of importance had been said in my absence. "We were just discussing a few options," she said, her tone measured, offering a version of the truth that excluded everything that mattered. I nodded once, glancing briefly at the paper spread across the table before looking back at her, my expression unchanged. "I assumed as much," I replied, my voice calm, neither challenging nor inviting further explanation. Daniel shifted slightly in his seat, his gaze flickering between us, but he did not speak. He did not correct her. He did not include me. And in that silence, I understood more than any explanation could have provided. They were no longer considering me part of the decision. I stood there for another second, just long enough to let that realization settle fully, then turned and walked back toward the kitchen without another word, leaving them exactly where they were, exactly as they had chosen to be. Behind me, their conversation resumed, quieter now, more guarded, but it continued, because they still believed the same thing they had believed from the beginning. That I was unaware. That I was uninvolved. That I was already stepping aside. And I let them keep that belief because every word they spoke, every decision they made under that assumption, only brought them closer to a conclusion they were not prepared to face. That evening, after the house had settled into its usual quiet and the faint hum of conversation downstairs had faded into something distant and indistinct, I returned to Edward's study once more, closing the door behind me with the same deliberate care, not to hide what I was doing, but to create a space where nothing needed to be explained. The desk looked exactly as it had before, orderly, composed, untouched by the assumptions unfolding in the rest of the house, and I took my seat with a calm that no longer required effort. I reached for the drawer again, unlocking it with the same key, the motion now familiar, and this time I did not hesitate as I gathered what I needed, the documents Edward had prepared, the letter in his unmistakable handwriting, the account details that existed quietly beyond the reach of anyone who had believed they understood our situation. I placed them neatly into a folder of my own, aligning each page with precision, not out of habit but out of intention because this was no longer about discovery, it was about execution. I did not rush. There was no urgency in my movements, no trace of anxiety or doubt, only a steady clarity that had replaced everything else. When I finished, I closed the drawer, returned the key to its place and stood, carrying the folder with me as I stepped back into the hallway. The house was dimly lit now, the soft glow of lamps casting long shadows across the walls, and as I moved toward the front of the house, I could hear Ashley's voice again, lower now, more relaxed. the tone of someone who believed the most difficult part was already behind her. I paused just outside the living room, not out of hesitation but to listen, to allow their certainty to reveal itself fully. "We should schedule the meeting for early next week," she was saying, her voice calm, decisive. "It is better to move quickly before anything becomes complicated." Daniel responded quietly, his words less distinct, but his agreement was clear in the cadence of his voice, in the absence of resistance, in the way he allowed her to shape the direction without question. I stepped into the room then, not interrupting, simply entering, and both of them looked up, their expressions shifting almost instantly, Ashley's into that familiar composed politeness, Daniel's into something more neutral, more guarded. I walked to the armchair near the window and sat down, placing the folder gently on my lap, my posture relaxed, my expression unchanged, and for a moment none of us spoke. The silence was not uncomfortable, not for me, but it held a different weight now, something they could not yet define. Ashley recovered first. "Is everything all right?" she asked, her tone carefully balanced, as if she were offering concern while measuring my response at the same time. I met her gaze without effort. "Everything is very clear," I said, my voice steady, carrying no trace of accusation, only certainty. There was a brief pause, a subtle shift in the room, as though something had moved just slightly out of alignment, but not enough yet for them to recognize it. Daniel leaned forward a fraction, his attention narrowing, but he did not speak. I rested my hand lightly on the folder, not opening it, not presenting it, simply letting it exist there between us, visible but unexplained, and I saw Ashley's eyes flicker toward it for just a second before returning to my face. "We were just discussing the next steps," she said again, repeating herself as if reinforcement might restore the balance she felt slipping. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without engaging with it. "I heard," I replied, my tone even, almost reflective, and then I allowed a small pause before continuing. "You have both been very thorough." It was not praise. It was not agreement. It was simply a statement, but I could see the way it settled differently, the way it introduced something they had not accounted for, something that did not fit neatly into the version of events they had constructed. I did not explain further. I did not elaborate. I simply sat there, composed, patient, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for them to feel it, to sense that something had shifted, even if they could not yet name it. Because the moment had come when observation was no longer enough, when preparation had quietly become action, and yet I still did not need to reveal everything. Not all at once. Not yet. They had built their plans on certainty, and now, without raising my voice, without changing my tone, I had introduced something far more powerful: doubt. The next morning, I did not wait for them to begin the conversation, nor did I allow the day to unfold under their direction, because there was no longer any reason to observe from a distance when everything I needed was already in place. I entered the dining room at exactly 8 o'clock, the same time Edward and I had shared breakfast for decades, and I took my usual seat at the head of the table, placing the folder in front of me with quiet precision. Ashley arrived a few minutes later, her expression momentarily tightening when she saw me there, already settled, already composed, as if I had claimed something she believed was no longer mine. Daniel followed behind her, slower, his gaze lingering on the folder before shifting back to my face, uncertainty flickering there for the first time. I did not greet them immediately. I allowed them to take their seats, to settle into the roles they had assumed so confidently the day before, and only then did I speak. "I think it is time we review everything together," I said, my voice calm, steady, leaving no room for interpretation. Ashley straightened slightly, her posture adjusting as if preparing to regain control of the conversation. "Of course," she replied, her tone smooth. "We were planning to go over the details again this week." I nodded once, acknowledging her words without accepting them. Then I opened the folder. The sound was soft, deliberate, but in the silence of the room, it carried more weight than anything that had been said so far. I turned the first document toward them, not pushing it across the table, not forcing it into their hands, simply placing it where it could be seen. "These are the accounts Edward established separately," I said, my voice even almost conversational, as if I were discussing something ordinary, something expected. Ashley's eyes moved quickly across the page, her expression shifting in small, controlled increments, the confidence in her posture tightening into something less certain. Daniel leaned forward, his brow furrowing as he read, the quiet rhythm of his breathing changing just enough to reveal that he was beginning to understand. I did not rush them. I did not fill the silence with explanation. I simply turned the next page. These are the protections he put in place, I continued, my tone unchanged, to ensure that nothing would be altered without my consent. Ashley's composure faltered for the first time, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be hidden entirely. A brief pause, a slight hesitation before she spoke. I was not aware of these arrangements, she said, her voice still controlled but no longer effortless. I met her gaze directly. I know, I replied. There was no accusation in my voice. No need for it. The truth was already in front of them. Daniel looked up then, his eyes searching mine, not with defiance, but with something closer to realization, as if he were seeing the situation from a perspective he had not considered until this moment. Mom, he began, his voice quieter now, uncertain in a way I had not heard in years, but I raised my hand slightly, not to silence him, but to pause what he was about to say. There is more, I said gently, and I turned to the final document, the one Edward had prepared with the most care. Any decisions regarding this house, these assets, or any part of our estate, I continued, require my full authorization. Not assumption. Not suggestion. Authorization. The word settled into the room with quiet finality. Ashley leaned back slightly, her posture no longer as composed as it had been, her eyes moving between the documents and my face as she recalculated everything she had believed to be certain. Daniel said nothing. He simply sat there, the weight of the realization settling over him, the understanding that the foundation of their plans had never existed in the way they thought it did. I closed the folder slowly, aligning the edges once more, and rested my hands lightly on top of it. You both believed I had been left with nothing, I said, my voice calm, almost reflective, and you made your decisions based on that belief. I let the words sit there, not as an accusation but as a statement of fact. Then I stood, my movements steady, unhurried, and looked at them one final time. You were wrong, I said simply. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to, because in that moment everything that had been unspoken, everything that had been assumed, had been corrected without force, without conflict, without anything more than the truth presented exactly as it was. I picked up the folder and walked out of the room, leaving them exactly where they were, surrounded not by uncertainty anymore, but by clarity they could no longer avoid, and for the first time since Edward's funeral, the silence that followed was not something imposed on me. It was something I had chosen.